There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. But Abraham is common for us to use, so what we're going to do is we're just going to call him Abraham. And even though all we read there, it said Abram. And this name, Exalted Father, it had to have been a constant reminder to Abraham and Sarah that they had no children. Because every time they would call his name, Exalted Father, it must have seemed to them of being a really bad joke. And at this time, when he's called, he's probably about 70 years old, and Sarah's there. She's probably in her 60s. And we read about Abraham, and he's mentioned many times in scriptures, and his title almost is Abraham, the friend of God. And there's nobody else in the Old Testament who was ever called God's friend. And so what this tells me is that I believe that Abraham was probably a great guy. I think he was probably very likable. And, you know, we look at the Jewish people today and we read about them in the Bible, and not all of them reflect this man's great nature. But I believe when God calls somebody a friend, I'm sure he must have been very friendly. And throughout his life, we will see Abraham, and he'll be taking care of his family, and he takes care of all these acquaintances. And you always see him being more than fair, and he's always generous. But what Abraham is known for, it's not his friendliness, but he's known for his faith. And as you see here, as we're reading, you see he doesn't really start out that well. But by the time we're done with Abraham and we see his life unfold, we'll see that he ends perfectly. Now, Sarai, Abraham's wife, her name means contentious. And it may have really fit her because she was a woman who couldn't have any children. And she was married to this man named Exalted Father. And a woman not able to bear children in that culture was considered shameful, that she had been cursed. It was as if she had done something so wrong that she's been cursed by God. But later on, God changes her name also, and he changes her name to Princess, which is Sarah. And that's what we're going to call her from now on. We're going to call her Sarah because Princess is a much nicer name than contentious. So Abraham, about 70, living in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and Ur, where that's located, that's in Iraq. And it's not really far from what we read last week in the Tower of Babel. And this area is known as Mesopotamia. And we read later on in the scriptures that Abraham is described as being a Syrian or an Aramean. And that's because that's what he was, because that's where he was from. Abraham wasn't a Jew. He became the father of the Jews. But Abraham, he was known as a Hebrew because all that means is that he was descended from Eber, because that's where the name Hebrew comes from the name Eber. And we just read that in his family tree. Now, Abraham, when he was in Ur, he was an idolater. And both the city of Ur and also in the land of Haran, they worshiped the moon god, which was called Nana. Now, I had a Nana. She didn't worship the moon god. She was a Catholic. This Nana was a man, and it was the moon god. And they worshiped many other gods, but that was their main deity in that area. And you realize that their gods were the same gods that the Canaanites served and all the different people served. They just had different names in different locations. So Abraham, he's an idolater. He lives in Iraq, and he's been raised by idolaters. And now God intervenes in his life. And so at 70 years old, God called Abraham. Abraham did not deserve it. He didn't earn it. It was God's mercy. It was out of God's grace. And God had a reason to call Abraham, because through this man, Abraham, God was going to save the world. And we get a little bit of background of the call of Abraham in the book of Acts in chapter 7, verse 2. And it says, this is when Stephen was being stoned to death, and he was giving to the Jewish leaders a little history of their history. And he says, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Haran. And he said to him, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. So God appeared to Abraham when he was in the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and he told him to go to the land of Canaan. But Abraham was only supposed to take Sarah, his wife, because God told Abraham that he was to leave his family. But we read here that Abraham took all of them with him. He took everyone except for one brother named Nahor and his brother's wife named Milcah. And those people, they'll show up a little bit later in the book of Genesis when Abraham goes to find a wife for his son Isaac. Okay, so here we have Terah. Now, Terah, that's Abraham's father. And so he's the patriarch of this family. And it's a patriarchal society. The father is the head. And he decides to go with Abraham. And he not only decides to go with Abraham, he brings along his poor, young, orphaned grandson, Lot, who happens to be Abraham's nephew. So in my mind, this looks kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies. It's kind of like a mismatched bunch of misfits. And the Lord, he wants to do a work, but I don't think it's really through these people, because it's like you got Granny and Jethro, and they're going to go along with Jed and Ellie Mae. And they're packing up the car, and they're going to go to Beverly, but instead of Beverly, they're supposed to be going to Canaan. But they don't get to Canaan. In fact, they don't even get very far. They only got about 500 miles, and they ended up in this place, this town of Haran. But Abraham, he wasn't called to Haran. He was called to go to the land of Canaan. But they stopped in Haran. And the reason possibly is because Terah, he was very old. He may not have been able to go any further. And so they stayed there in that land of Haran, to that city, until Terah died. And he died at 205. So now we have this middle-aged couple. They're childless. And now they're basically stuck taking care of Lot. Because Lot, he doesn't have anybody else. And they don't have any children of their own. But I don't believe this is the way it was intended to be. Because when you study Lot, you study Abraham's life, Lot only brought trouble into Abraham's life. He had to save Lot when he was captured. And you see Lot go off, and he makes his home in Sodom with the wickedest people of the whole land of Canaan. So I don't really believe Terah and Lot, they were called to go with Abraham, that God did call him to leave his family. And I say, sometimes I think this looks like us. Sometimes God calls us just like he called Abraham, where God has revealed himself to us, and we find out that God, he has this plan for our lives. And when he calls us, and when we're called to go somewhere or to do some kind of work, he doesn't call everyone to go with us. So when we get saved and we know God has a plan for our life, we're not supposed to really be dragging our old life with us. He doesn't intend for us to take all our old friends or our non-believing family along with us. He doesn't even always call our believing family, because the way God calls people, he calls each of us, and he calls each of us alone. Now, I'm going to suppose that Abraham had told Terah and he had told Lot about God's revealing himself to him and this call that he had on his life. And he probably told him about all these promises that God was making him. And I'm going to suppose they also believed it. And they had joined themselves to Abraham's vision. But it's not what God said. God didn't call Abraham to a group project. And he doesn't call us usually to a group project. Even though there may be others alongside, we're all called separately, but we may be going the same direction, but we're all called alone. Because when God calls us, he calls us to a work, and that's a work that he's prepared us to do. Or when he calls you, he's called you to a work that he's been preparing you to do. And if you notice, God never spoke to Abraham that whole time that he was in Haran. And he doesn't speak to him again until he's in the land of Canaan. He doesn't speak to him again until Abraham actually does the very first thing that he told him to do. And so sometimes in our lives, God's already told us what to do. And it could have been sometime in the past, and we may have got off track, and we might have been spending some time in Haran, and maybe we even haven't heard God's voice in a while. And we're waiting to hear that next step God has. But sometimes he's not going to give us that next step until we're obedient to the last thing he's told us to do. But here in Abraham's life, all it's done is it's only postponed this work that God wanted to do in Abraham and Sarah's life. So Abraham's disobedience, it did not take God's plan away, because this plan was never dependent on Abraham's obedience. Because God's plan is to live through Abraham, to bring his son into the world. And God's plan of bringing Jesus into the world was never, ever dependent on man and man's obedience. And it's God's mercy that he continues to work in Abraham's life. And what this should do, this should give us hope, because we're told that Abraham is the father of faith. And you can see that his faith, it's not perfect, but it'll get better. But he didn't always have complete obedience. He's like us. And God still led him, and God is still going to carry out this plan that he has for Abraham's life. And Abraham is going to learn obedience. He's going to learn to act in faith. But the truth is that through his disobedience, it really caused a whole lot of hardships that he never had to have. It caused a lot of tears for him and for Sarah. But God, in his sovereignty, he's already seen it. He's already seen Abraham's life before him. Because God, when he looks at our lives and when he looked at his life, he sees it from the viewpoint of eternity. So this is how it is when someone is willing to turn around. So if you're willing to turn around, God is able to restore his plan for our lives. And that's even if we get off track. Okay, so what is God's plan for Abram and Sarah's life? Well, the plan's pretty simple, that they're going to build a family.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.